hello everyone. Welcome to this public lecture from our first Bristol Illustrious Visiting Professor, Professor Mamokgethi Phakeng. Professor Phakeng has led the University of Cape Town in South Africa as its Vice-Chancellor since 2018. And in October last year, we were really delighted to welcome her virtually to the University of Bristol for her year-long visiting professorship. We're delighted to be hosting this event today, and we were really keen to align this public lecture from such an inspirational woman with International Women's Day, which is today, Tuesday, the 8th of March. So our event today will be chaired, introduced and supported by fantastic women from across academia and professional services in our two institutions. My name's Lauren Winch, and I'm the manager of the International Research Partnerships portfolio here at the University of Bristol, which includes this new Bristol Illustrious Visiting Professorship scheme. I'll shortly hand you over to our provost, Professor Judith Squires, to introduce our illustrious visitor. However, for those in the webinar, I just want to run through a quick bit of housekeeping first. So you'll see that we're joined by Untitled from the University of Cape Town, who will be providing South African Sign Language interpretation throughout the webinar. So we've spotlighted her so that she's clearly visible to anyone with hearing issues in the live stream. If you're in the main webinar and don't require that sign language interpretation, you can choose to unpin her and change your view so you can focus on the speaker. And you can just do that through the settings in the top right-hand corner. Otherwise, the default will be that you've got the side by side. You should also be able to switch on subtitles using the live transcript button at the bottom of the screen if you would find that helpful. Please make sure that you've added your name rather than being listed as guest or a kind of cryptic name, just so we can ensure that all of the attendees are legitimate, and also so we know who's asking questions when we get to that portion of the webinar. If you do have any questions for Professor Phakeng, please enter these in the Q&A box, which you'll find on the bottom bar of the screen. And remember to add your name and your organisation when you type your question, so we know who's asking the questions. Our event chair, Dr. Angeline Barrett, will be putting the questions to Professor Phakeng after her presentation, which I'm sure we're all looking forward to. We'll get through as many of those as we can in the time we have, and apologies in advance if we don't get to your question, and feel free to get in touch with my team. We'll provide the contact information at the end if there is anything you'd like to follow up in. And just ask, please be respectful in your comments and questions and keep them relevant to the topic of today's talk. We do reserve the right to remove anyone from our webinars if we feel their comments are inappropriate. Not something you've ever had to do, but just to note that. And finally, just a reminder that this webinar is being live streamed and recorded, and that recording will be shared publicly online via our YouTube page and website. So if you do need to leave early or have any connection issues or would like to share it with colleagues and friends, that will be available, and we'll be sharing that link with everyone who signed up today. So I'm now delighted to hand over to Deputy Vice-Chancellor and Provost of the University of Bristol, Professor Judith Squires, who's going to introduce Professor Mamokgethi Phakeng.
Thank you very much, Lauren, and welcome everybody to this International Women's Day event. It's fantastic to see so many of you here virtually. As Lauren said, I'm Judith Squires. I'm the Deputy Vice-Chancellor and Provost at the University of Bristol. Before I start today, I did just want to introduce the speaker. I did just want to acknowledge that I am aware that the ongoing military action in Ukraine has impacted many colleagues and students at universities right across the globe. Our thoughts are with all of those affected by current events. So I want now to welcome you all to our inaugural Benjamin Meeker Illustrious Visiting Professor Lecture. And it's a lecture given to us by Professor Mamokgethi Phakeng, who is speaking us today on International Women's Day. Professor Mamokgethi Phakeng is Vice-Chancellor of the University of Cape Town, and this is a post she's held since 2018, prior to which she was the Deputy Vice-Chancellor for Research and Internationalisation at the University of Cape Town. And then before that, she was the Vice Principal for Research and Innovation at the University of South Africa. She holds a PhD in mathematics education and is a highly regarded scientist with over 80 research papers and 5 edited public volumes published in her name. She's also an honorary life member of the Association of Mathematics Education in South Africa and a fellow of the African Academy of Sciences. She served as a member of the board for the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research and led the Association for Mathematics Education of South Africa as its first woman national president from 2002 to 2006. She's also served as founding chairperson of the board of the South African Mathematics Foundation. Professor Phakeng has won numerous awards for her research and for her community work, including the Order of Baobab, conferred on her by the President of South Africa in 2016. And in 2014, CEO magazine named her the most influential woman academic in Africa. And in 2016, she was awarded the prestigious Businesswoman of the Year award in the education category. And in 2020, she was included in Forbes' inaugural list of 50 most powerful women in Africa. In July 2019, we were really honoured that Professor Phakeng accepted an honorary doctorate in science from us here at the University of Bristol in recognition for her leadership role in mathematics education in South Africa. And we were really proud that she accepted our invitation to become our inaugural Benjamin Mika Illustrious Visiting Professor, and that she is able to speak with us here today to celebrate International Women's Day. So I'm going to hand you over now to Professor Phakeng, who's going to speak on her lecture today, One Country, Many Languages, Can South Africa's Multilingualism Contribute to Social Cohesion? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Judith. And thank you to everyone who's attending the lecture. I hope we can have a conversation afterwards. What does it mean to be fluent in at least 6 of the 11 official languages of South Africa, and yet be denied an opportunity to join the military because your matric English score was 45%, and what is needed is a 50% pass? You are denied even though you passed your home language, isiXhosa, which is one of the official languages in South Africa with a 78% score. How does it feel when you hear politicians talk about the progressive language policy that encourages multilingualism? Well, this is the situation in many post-colonial countries. In the meantime, leaders in other parts of the world are also talking much about and making statements about the importance of policies that recognize multilingualism. In 2019, British university researchers, teachers, and politicians issued a statement calling for a comprehensive national policy that would recognize the United Kingdom as a multilingual society and protect the languages of all its citizens. They referred to non-English languages as a vital part of the cultural heritage of many British citizens and residents, as well as an asset in developing professional careers. They were not the first to promote multilingualism in the UK. 2 years earlier, in November 2017, Oxford Professor Catherine Cole, in her capacity as the lead researcher on the Creative Multilingualism Research Program, attended a language and development conference in Senegal. She reported, and I quote, that like African countries, the UK is both culturally and linguistically diverse. By celebrating and nurturing our linguistic riches, we can help to ensure that all cultural groups feel equally valued, while at the same time equipping young people to go beyond English in contributing to the global conversation, close quote. In the same report, Professor Cole pointed out that language was, and I quote, an emotive issue in African government policy, close quote. Indeed, while these academics and politicians express laudable hopes for the benefits of a multilingual society, they may not have considered, maybe deeply, the highly political nature of language. Language is political. Language is political in the sense that it has implications for how social goods are or ought to be distributed. And social goods, as G explains, are anything that a group of people believes to be a source of power, status, or wealth. The fact that English is a language of power and socioeconomic advancement in South Africa makes English a valued linguistic resource in education and in society in general. And let's face it, even though Indigenous African languages enjoy an official status in South Africa, they still do not enjoy the same kind of status as English. What language one uses, when and how, is no trivial decision. For those of us who are multilingual, decisions about which language to use, how, and for what are always political. Of course, how we use language or how we language our thoughts, that is not innocent either, even if it's in the same language. When people speak or write, they create a political perspective. They use language to project themselves as certain kinds of people engaged in certain kinds of activity. As a Vice-Chancellor, I am at once a scholar of mathematics education. I'm an executive, but I'm also a Black African woman who grew up in the township and understands the plight of the poor because I've been there myself. So in my job, when workers go on strike at UCT and I decide to engage with them, I make sure that I do not talk with them as a scholar or as an executive, because that will present me as a kind of person they should be fighting with, one who's privileged and does not understand the plight of the poor. I will avoid using academic jargon deliberately and may even use an African language, because there are also different sorts of status attached to these two identities. That of a scholar and an African who understands and identifies with the plight of the poor. Words are never just words. Language is not just a vehicle to express ideas, but also a socio-political tool that we use to enact a particular who engaged in a particular what. As a Black African woman Vice-Chancellor, I have an identity that shifts and takes different shapes as I move across the context. Being an executive, a scholar, a Black African who grew up poor in the apartheid South Africa. Indeed, I will enact multiple identities in and through language in these contexts. Sometimes, well, in fact, often, it helps us get a breakthrough when we have contestations between different constituencies on campus. Identities, of course, can be multiple. Fairclough refers to institutional and social identities. According to Fairclough, institutions impose upon people ways of talking and seeing as a condition for qualifying them to act as subjects. This means that institutions impose certain identities on people. For example, to be a Vice-Chancellor, one is expected to master the discursive and ideological norms which the academic profession attaches to that subject position, or should I have said, which Senate attaches to that subject position. That is, one must learn to talk like a VC. Well, if one is compliant, one must learn to talk like a VC and see things like a VC. These ways of talking and seeing are inseparably intertwined in the sense that in the process of acquiring the ways of talking, which are associated with the subject position, one necessarily also acquires its ways of seeing. Any social practice can thus be regarded as a speech and ideological community. Vice-Chancellorship is a speech and ideological community. To be part of this social practice, you need to talk and see things like a VC. Well, if you want to have an easy time. Any social practice imparts ways of talking and seeing that are relevant for that practice. And this is a kind of shared knowledge which people need in order to participate in that social practice. In the case of a VC, it is the kind of knowledge that one needs in order to say acceptable things in an appropriate way. Since this shared knowledge is rooted in the practice of socio-culturally defined groups of people, we refer to it as culture. what people must know in order to act as they do, make things they make, and interpret their experience in the distinctive way they do. Thus, they would argue that to be a VC, one needs more than just academic achievements. One also needs the cultural knowledge of vice-chancellorship. Any VC who does not act accordingly is regarded as disruptive or naive or not ready. Somehow, sometimes people don't assume that you are being deliberate by disrupting what vice-chancellorship is meant to be. So what does it mean for a multilingual post-colonial country as South Africa? In 1997, South Africa announced a new language in education policy that recognizes 11 official languages, including English, and encourages multilingualism. According to this policy, not only can South African schools and learners now choose their language of learning and teaching, but there is a policy environment supportive of the use of languages other than one favored language of learning and teaching in school. And so too, of language practices like the practice of using multiple languages in one speech act, whether you call it translanguaging or code switching or whatever it is. Well, this policy is widely acknowledged as good and inclusive, but on the ground, it's meeting significant constraints. Research suggests that most schools are not opting to use Indigenous African languages as languages of learning and teaching in both policy and practice. In many ways, this situation is not unexpected. I mean, you'd think that politicians would know that this would happen because mother tongue instruction has a bad image among speakers of African languages. It is associated with apartheid and hence inferior education. Parents' memories of Bantu education, combined with their perception of English as a gateway to better education, are making the majority of Black parents favor English from the beginning of school, even if their children do not know the language before they go to school. Since 1994, the South African government has developed language policy frameworks with the emphasis of multilingualism and equity of access and success for all students in higher education. The Constitution of the Republic of South Africa that came out in 1996, the Higher Education Act 1997 as amended, the Language Policy for Higher Education in 2002, and more recently, the Language Policy Framework for Public Higher Education Institutions that was published in 2020. These are some of the policies. The main purpose for all these policies is to ensure the development and strengthening of Indigenous languages as languages of scholarship, teaching and learning, and communication in South African universities. The policy framework is also meant to highlight the role of higher education in promoting and creating conditions for the development of historically marginalized official South African languages, as well as the Khoi, Nama, and San languages, and sign language. While all these post-apartheid language policies in South Africa are intended to address the overvaluing of English and Afrikaans and the undervaluing of African languages, in practice, English continues to dominate. Although it's a language of a minority, English is both the language of power and the language of educational and socio-economic advancement. In other words, it is a dominant symbolic resource in what Bourdieu would call the linguistic market in South Africa. The linguistic market is embodied by and acted in the many key situations in which symbolic resources like certain types of linguistic skills are demanded of social actors if they want to gain access to valuable social, educational, and eventually material resources. Various institutional arrangements and government policies over the many years before the end of apartheid resulted in the dominance of English in the linguistic market. First, there was a policy of English and Afrikaans medium higher education in South Africa for many years. the language of learning and teaching in most of the South African universities, public universities, is English even today. And it seems that this policy will continue for many more years since it has not been problematized in higher education circles. In fact, Black Africans prefer that we have English. The only time there's contestation about the language of learning and teaching at universities is when the Afrikaans community comes to the fore and insists that they want to have Afrikaans also as a language of learning and teaching in particular universities. Interestingly, and I want to digress a little bit here, the reason, if you read the history of how we came to 11 official languages in South Africa, actually, our leaders were quite happy to have English only as the official language. We came to 11 because the Afrikaans community was insisting that Afrikaans should be one of the official languages. And as the reports say, after much debate, the compromise was reached. Let's include all the languages. So the African languages, in a way, were an afterthought. Perhaps my critique today is not misplaced because maybe if we wanted that from the beginning, we would have thought about it carefully. Well, the second thing is that there is an English language prerequisite for anyone aspiring to become a professional in South Africa. Students need to pass a school leaving examination in English as a first or second language, in addition to mathematics, for example, to enter and succeed in the English medium training programs in professional fields such as medicine, science, engineering, and technology, and to earn qualifications to enter these high-income professions. The symbolic market is therefore not just a metaphor, but one with transactions that have material socio-economic consequences for individuals. Thirdly, there have been policies upholding English and Afrikaans as official. Before apartheid, these were the two official languages. And so these are the only two languages that were regarded as legal and government languages. The 9 indigenous African languages spoken by the majority of South Africans did not enjoy any official status until 1994, when the democratic government came into power. However, these languages are still in many ways secondary to English in reality. For example, most of the policy documents are written in English. Perhaps in some provinces, you might find a translation into another language. I suspect most of the translations are into Afrikaans rather than all the other indigenous South African languages. With these institutions and policies so well entrenched in the various administrative, educational, and professional arenas of South Africa, a symbolic market has been formed where English constitutes the dominant, if not exclusive, symbolic resource. It is a prerequisite for individuals aspiring to gain a share of the socio-economic material resources enjoyed by an elite group. Finally, there's been the imposition of an English Afrikaans language requirement for individuals aspiring to join the civil service. For instance, ability to communicate in English or Afrikaans is one of the requirements for anyone willing to train as a police officer or to get into the military. The fact remains that English is the most important criterion for selection for high-ranking officials, and knowledge of an African language is seen as an additional asset, but not an essential one. In fact, it is not valued. So if you like, you can say we are in a multilingual country with a multilingual policy, but monolingual practices. South Africa's multilingual policy offers us a choice of a language that we want our children to be taught in. It offers wherever you are. Our constitution says you can actually, as a learner, as parents, or as a student at university, choose the language in which you want to be taught. This policy assumes that teachers, parents, and learners in South Africa together with the parents and anyone else who's supporting them, are somehow free of economic, political, and ideological constraints and pressures when they apparently freely opt for English as a language of learning and teaching. Our multilingual policies seem to be taking a structuralist and positivist view of language, one that suggests that all languages can be free of cultural and political influences. Given the hegemony of English, the choice that our policy offers is a false choice, and the promise of inclusivity and social cohesion that such a policy offers is false. The point is that not all languages are equally powerful, and the hegemony of English is an international phenomenon. So even if someone says you've got the power of numbers, so isiZulu can be a powerful language, as powerful as some of the African languages are, not all languages are equally powerful. And the hegemony of English goes beyond national borders. And therefore, enforcing purist home language or English-only monolingual teaching at any level of education is not consistent. One can argue that it's not consistent with our multilingual policies and can be seen as discriminatory. In the case of home language monolingual teaching, it suggests that if you have money, then you can buy access to English at basic education. Because in fact, the schools at basic education level that are compelled to teach in an African language are those in townships, rural villages, and farms. If you go to a former whites-only school, then you can escape that. It's not about multilingualism. It's not about inclusivity. It's about how much money you have to buy yourself into English. Access to English means access to social goods such as higher education, jobs, international opportunities, status, etc. In the case of English, only monolingual teaching, in case of those who say, well, let's go for English only monolingual teaching, that will suggest that African learners or students are not allowed to be who they are. They should only speak in English. It is therefore, in my view, important to explore multilingual approaches to teaching and learning, both in basic education and at university. I think often we think about this issue as an issue of choice. You've got to choose one language or the other, even in a multilingual country as ours, where English is as powerful as it is. So I thought, so what would I do if I had the power? If I had the power to tell the country, this is the way to go, I would give the following recommendations. In my abstract, I said 3, but they are somewhat more than 3. I think they're 5. I would suggest the following 5 recommendations, and I'll just get to them now. The first one is that I would say, well, South Africa is an African country, and so it should be mandatory for every South African or everyone who lives in South Africa to learn at least one of the 9 official South African indigenous languages. That's not too much to ask. If you go and work in Paris or in Ottawa, it's just as simple as that. The issue of learning French is there in front of you. So I would say that's where I would start. And then to pass metric, I would say we've got to add this requirement that a learner must pass at least one indigenous African language as a subject by a minimum of 50%. At the moment, the requirements are that learners take a home language and an additional language. And a home language, they must pass it 50%. And guess what the Black African learners do? they choose English as a home language, even if they are not fluent at it, because that's the language of learning that they want. It's not so much just about the English, it's about what English gives them access to. It's not because they hate themselves, it's not because they hate their culture. It's what English gives them access to. Another recommendation, I would say each university has to adopt one of the 9 official South African Indigenous languages as an additional official language for all students and staff to learn. On achieving fluency, a staff member can be recognized with additional remuneration, and students will gain a credit or credits that serve as one of the requirements for them to obtain their degree. Well, if you're frowning about me saying staff will be recognized with remuneration, well, if you go teach at the University of Ottawa, if you are fluent in both French and English, you get paid a little more. Why? Because you're a little useful than people who are monolingual. Thirdly, I would say being fluent in more than one Indigenous African language must be a requirement for everyone in the public sector and all those whose work is client-facing. That is, whose work requires interaction with the public. What's the point of having professionals in our public service who are monolingual in a multilingual country such as ours? How do they serve the public? What does it mean? I guess we can ask the same question for countries that talk about multilingualism and wanting to value other languages. What does it mean to say you value other languages, but when I go to the doctor, it really doesn't matter. I need an interpreter, or we'll be using sign language that we don't share. So I think being fluent in more than one Indigenous African language needs to be a requirement for everyone in the public sector. And then fourthly, fluency in one of the 9 official South African Indigenous languages must be an added advantage for anyone seeking employment. And this kind of fluency ought to be remunerated because their fluency in a multiplicity of languages means that one can communicate with a much wider and diverse audience, and thus they are more useful. We can draw on them way more. Just like when I have a worker protest at UCT, I don't go there and I'm not stuck with English. I can switch to another language. And just by doing that, I'm saying something, not about myself only, but about the leadership of the university. Fifthly, African languages should only be taught in an African language. I know this might sound weird. In South Africa, there are many South African universities. Of course, not all universities teach African languages. In the early 2000s, many universities stopped teaching African languages because they argued that they are too expensive. There aren't many students, and therefore they stopped teaching them. And some of those that didn't stop actually teach an African language in English. That's even more of an insult than anything else. So when I meet a student from University X who majored in Sesotho, and I say 2 simple sentences, and they tell me they've majored in Sesotho, I say 2 simple sentences in Sesotho and they can't respond because they've learned Sesotho in English. So in essence, they are learning about African languages rather than learning their languages. But what do all these things that I'm saying we should do, why do them, and what will be achieved? What I'm trying to do with my recommendations, and in my view, they can be recontextualized for other multilingual contexts, is that they try to deal with the problem that Indigenous South African languages do not give you access to any kind of social good. And so what we need to do is to endow them with power so that people can be able to exchange them for some form of capital, whether cultural, social, intellectual, whatever. At the moment, it doesn't mean anything. That's why even if someone got 75% for isiXhosa and 40% for English, they still don't get accepted in the military. So endowing the languages, the indigenous languages with power is important. But secondly, more people will learn indigenous South African languages, because when you say everyone who works in the public sector, everyone who goes to university, everyone who goes to school, basic education in the country has to learn N African languages. What you will have is more people speaking indigenous South African languages. And so there will be value in being fluent, because if I'm fluent, I stand in those languages, I stand a chance of getting a job, or of getting an opportunity, or of getting business in South Africa. So it will provide some access to social goods, or some kind of social good. It will also mean that South Africans living in the same area will have a shared language, and that will promote interaction and bonding between them without any group feeling less than, or feeling marginalized simply because their language is not recognized. One of the things that causes polarization in our society is because people of different races don't talk as much as they should. And if they have to talk, it is the marginalized or the formerly oppressed that have to change up their game and speak English to have a conversation, making them feel like, well, you're not needed here. Of course, this is your continent, this is your country, but hey, you got to be like us to be able to talk like us. That breeds a lot of anger. It adds on to the many other challenges that we have. And I think if we can promote a way to interact and a way for people to bond with people who are in the same area with them, at least in the same area with them, it will create some sense of unity. There are many countries that are post-colonial, but they share a language. And when you look at the different ways in which different societies have evolved, you can see in places where there's a shared language, there's some issues that they don't have, that we have, even 27 years after democracy. And so my view is language can be an important tool for social cohesion. It will not solve the whole problem, but it will create, it will at least help ease the tensions that are so present in our midst as we go on as a country. Thank you very much. I look forward to a conversation with you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Professor Phakeng. That was so inspiring and thought-provoking. I'm sure it's going to generate a really engaged discussion, and particularly around the kind of recommendations and exploring how that might work in practice. So I'm now going to hand over to the chair for our Q&A session, who's Dr. Angeline Barrett, a reader in education who, in collaboration with researchers and teacher educations in Tanzania, has actually developed a language support pedagogy for learners entering English medium secondary education after their primary education in Swahili. So the approach that herself and her colleagues used builds upon work by Professor Phakeng herself from earlier in her career on language in mathematics classrooms, as well as other world-leading research on multilingual education conducted by South African researchers. She's therefore the perfect person to chair this discussion, and I know Angeline's very much looking forward to it. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to her to take over for the Q&A.
Professor Phakeng, thank you very much for that challenging presentation, which I think you outlined some really important principles and a set of recommendations that are really directed towards raising the social capital, if you like, that's associated with African languages, which I think is very important. We've got one question so far. I've got a couple of questions also that I'd like to ask you. I'll start off with a question from Rachel Bowden, who's asking, she says, you've spoken about raising the social capital of Indigenous African languages. Does this not risk reinforcing the idea that standard languages exist and marginalizing people who speak non-standard varieties? What do you think about raising the status of translanguaging or plural literacy in South Africa, i.e. the ability to flexibly use resources from across languages, registers and dialects to communicate?
Thanks very much, Rachel. I mean, in my work, actually, in mathematics education, I advocate for trans languages. I don't really use the term, but I talk about multilingual approaches to teaching and learning. And in my talk today, I argue that actually we should get comfortable. We should actually advocate for multilingual approaches to teaching and learning. So we are not locked into standard languages or whether they exist or not. I'm not a linguist, but I would say, I mean, the space should allow for arguments from people who say they do exist. And one of the things that will happen with language use in this way, Indigenous African language use in this way, is that the languages themselves would grow to become languages that can use for scholarly interactions, for science, and so on. Oftentimes people say, well, they can't be used because, well, languages grow through use. So even the debate about standard languages, what is standard, what is not, because people want to use it for scholarship, I think that possibility should be opened. We can't, with this argument that I'm making, then argue that that debate or that of standard languages should stop. There will be people who go for that. There may be many other reasons. I'm neither here nor there because I'm about, in mathematics education, I'm about access to mathematics, and therefore translanguaging allows for that in a multilingual classroom where students don't have to declare the fact that their English is not good enough and ask the teacher to switch in another language, that those languages can be used just freely and comfortably, but you need the teachers or the lecturers to be fluent. And my recommendations, in a way, create a situation where the lecturers themselves, even when they come from outside the country, would ultimately be multilingual, know some of the local languages, and be able to work, use multiple languages in their teaching and learning.
Thank you, Mamokgethi.
Wow, interesting questions.
There's more questions coming up, yes. So we have a question from Andrew Bell, who says, thank you for the perspectives. From a South African point of view, how do you view the future of Russian being used in Ukraine, or based on its current associations with oppression and occupation? And he gives other examples. Should language be seen as a source of dominance or oppression, or as a simple reflection of history and culture that settled in the geographical areas? I think I'd like to remember at this point that Ukraine's president, who's been featured and been so prominent in the news, is himself a Russian speaker.
Yeah. Look, I mean, I think language is power. I mean, I don't want to take sides with Russia or Ukraine, but I want to focus on language. I mean, here's the thing, Angeline. Israel introduced a policy not a long time ago, I think less than 5 years ago, that every Israeli learner has to learn Arabic. Smart, I will do that. I said, great. And of course, you can look at where the Arabic, there aren't many scholars of Arabic. I mean, I spent time in Lebanon, and it is not a scholarship of Arabic. It's not growing, it's actually declining. And I said to the academics there that it's a matter of time where the scholars, the Arabic scholars, come from Israel. I mean, I think language is a source of power. If you know my language, we don't get along, how much power can you have? But it can also source something that brings us together. It's not that it can be used against only to oppress or whatever. I would say it's not about just oppressing or whatever. It's a powerful tool. And that's because of its political nature. You can use it whichever way you want to equip yourself for tough times of conflict, but also to ensure that you have access or you create a possibility for society to interact in ways that are not possible if they don't share a language. So I see it positively.
Thank you. There's a question about visual literacy. You're a maths educator, I'm a maths educator. I know how important visualization is in mathematics. There's a question about, do issues of visual literacy arise in relation to power imbalances? And this is somebody asking actually from the perspective of being involved in photography theory and culture. I wonder whether there's any, whether you see visual literacy or the use of visual communication, multimodal communication, as being integrated with these issues of language and power.
It is. I mean, it is. I mean, in mathematics, the mathematics language is loaded with representations. And so it can be a source of power because you can use those visual representations to communicate whatever you want to communicate. I mean, I see someone is asking about the Khoi and the San, and they used to use their art, their rock art, to communicate. So people who go past there would know the message that's written there. And of course, even in times of conflict, you can use particular kinds of art or representation to communicate in such a way that your opponent doesn't hear you, because language can overexpose you. So I think it does matter, both in subjects such as mathematics, but also just in conversations. I mean, if we don't want people to hear us, we use other ways if they know our language, and it's always representation. Angeline, can I take that question about the Khoi and the San not being counted as official languages in South Africa? Yes. I mean, that's the biggest boo-boo of our democratic government, of our ruling party. Because of course, as you know, that the languages, the Khoi languages are used on our crest, national crest, but they are not official. But it just also tells you how unready they were at CODESA when they were negotiating with our former oppressors. It wasn't really their initiative. And so some things come as afterthought. So at the moment, the languages are not official. So now they are added, including the Khoi and the San and Nama and so on and so forth. But actually what we should be doing as a country politically is to rush to develop the language, to make sure that the few people who still speak it can grow it. And that's why we at UCT launched the Khoi and San Center and wanting to develop Khoi studies as an area of study. At the moment, we're running a language course, but the idea is to develop it as an area of study, not only focusing on language, but on history, on art, on develop, because the Khoi and the San people are the first peoples of Cape Town. So we can only do this as a university, but I think we need a much bigger focus as a country. And as I say, it's a minus on our ruling party for treating it as an afterthought, and only actually doing it when the Khoi and the San community were demanding it and they were protesting at the Union building. What if they didn't do that?
And I guess one of the things that I'm aware of as somebody who works, I work in maths education, but also science education, and I'd like to really invite you to talk about, you've been talking about the South African context. What I'd like to invite you to talk about really is what African languages have to offer all of us beyond Africa. I think as a science educator, I'm very aware of some of the knowledge that students have that's silenced when they're not allowed to use their language in the classroom. And for some communities, that's quite detailed knowledge of the natural world, but also kind of different ways of seeing the natural world, which I think are important for the world today.
Absolutely. I mean, the students are silenced in classrooms, and so in my work, I argue that, I mean, ensuring that learners have access to mathematics. Language is an important aspect of that. It doesn't matter how good the teacher is. If the language is, students can express themselves or interact with others in a language, of learning and teaching, or that's allowed in class, then 80% of the learning doesn't happen, because learning happens better through and in interaction. So that's it. But in the same way, it works in the same way, even with adults. I can see with staff what happens. I mean, with students, you can see it. They're smart, they got brilliant results. We accepted them at UCT. They got the same results with students who come from first language English schools. But then they are shy to speak because firstly, they don't have the right accent. Secondly, their English, they're not sure whether it's good enough because they hear other people speaking with a twang, until, of course, I talk to them and I tell them I come from the same school and actually they shouldn't care about this twang, that it doesn't mean anything. And then there's a little bit of relaxation. But actually, they get silenced. The workers get silenced. And sometimes it gets to, where it gets to a point where there is literally no communication, because people can just keep quiet, not because they want to be quiet, but because they do not know whether what they have to say, they will be able to say it correctly. But this is also about the status of English, the hegemony of English. Is also emphasized by non-English speakers themselves. Because if you are fluent in English, if a 3-year-old speaks English, in the township, they are a sensation. Everybody talks about how smart they are, simply because they can express themselves in English. And if you have, there's been programs on TV where someone who's an adult, who's achieved much, maybe in the arts, is not so fluent in English. And what trends is how bad their English is. And it's often not the first language English speakers who mock their English. It's the non-English speaking community that mocks them, because English has got this status. And I'm thinking, if we endow African languages with the power that I say we should, first of all, people will not be under pressure to take interviews or do their shows in English. They can do them in other languages, and that wouldn't communicate that they are not smart enough. But also, we can have first language English speakers who might do things in African languages. Here's the thing, Angeline, if I taught you just simple greetings in isiZulu and walked into the room and said them, wow, non-English speakers give you a standing ovation. And I say to them, what the hell? We speak a lot of English. You don't even give us a standing ovation. We speak 11, 10, 9, 8 languages, and it's not special. But if an English speaker speaks any African language, it's so unexpected. It's regarded as so special that we want to hand over the whole country to them because they speak an African language. But that shows you the iniquity of language and who speaks it. That by saying the greetings, people assume that you must be progressive, you must like white people, you could never possibly ever be prejudiced at all. But if I did greetings in Portuguese, which I can, and French, or Maori, nobody says, wow, you speak French? People want a paragraph, and then they want a page, and then they want a whole book before they even smile, let alone a standing ovation, because more is expected from the formerly oppressed, if you like. I mean, it's like cooked up world, if you think about it.
We're running out of time, and there's a question here. You said that your 5 recommendations can be recontextualized for other contexts. UCT is an international university, and University of Bristol prides itself on being an international university. And we have a question from Zara Belia, who's talking about her experience of being an international student in the US, and the sense that she's had conversations with university colleagues about students' perceptions of themselves as writers. And both our multilingual and monolingual students enter spaces with the perception of being bad writers, often because of the hierarchy that teachers have placed on proper, in quotation marks, proper English. I mean, drawing on that, responding to that question, but perhaps going a little bit beyond that, what in your view, would Bristol have to do more in terms of promoting multilingualism? What could it be doing as an international university to kind of respond to these challenges, which, as you say, they appear in loads of post-colonial contexts, but I think, we also, in our way, we might have been the colonizer, but we're also in this post-colonial condition.
Well, perhaps let me start by telling you what we do at UCT, which is a lot, but still not enough. We could do more, okay? So at UCT, if you're studying to be a doctor or a teacher or a social worker, you are expected to do isiXhosa. You're supposed to pass isiXhosa 1. It doesn't matter where you come from. Even if you come from Mauritius or Bristol, you still have to do isiXhosa 1. So there's no exception. And our assumption is that you are going to serve the public and people who come to you either because they want an education or they have problems or they're sick. How do you serve the community when you can't speak the language? So that's a standard. And if you don't pass isiXhosa, it doesn't matter how many distinctions you have, you just don't graduate. And then the second thing that we do, I mean, when other universities close down the African languages departments, we offer 2 indigenous African languages. We've got a Department of African Languages. We've got Department of Languages. That's got all the, I mean, we've got Italian, French, Mandarin, Greek, and Portuguese, and all sorts of things. And of course, we also have isiXhosa and Sesotho. And we offer isiXhosa also as a major, and Sesotho we offer it as an elective. And we've been in conversation about scaling up Sesotho to a major as well. There's also conversations at the moment with the Dean of Humanities who wants to introduce Swahili. And our view is that we are an African university. I mean, we are a global university that's proud of its African identity. And so it's important for us to have another African language that's not necessarily a language of South Africa. So we chose isiXhosa because isiXhosa is a dominant language in the Western Cape. Sesotho, it's much closer, Eastern Cape, Lesotho, but Free State, and we want to introduce Swahili. But here's another thing that we're doing. Students in the engineering faculty cannot graduate. Part of the things, a requirement that they have to do is to take a semester course, a language course, study a language that's not their home language. We don't dictate in that regard that it should be an African language. So they might take Mandarin or French or whatever it is. But I think we are the only university that requires engineering students to do that. Of course, we also require them to take a humanities course, one humanities course, because there's a particular kind of graduate, engineering graduate, that we want to produce. And then, of course, we started the Khoi and San studies that we do here. Besides all of that, we've got in the math and accounting, we've got support material for students that's recorded, teaching that's done in the 11 official languages in accounting. So accounting students, they get taught in English, but they can go online and get the same lectures in any of the 10 official languages. So they can click Sesotho, Sepedi, or whatever. Those are recorded and they're there. And in mathematics, there's some, I think though in that one, it's not all the 11 languages, it's close. So there's attempts, and I'm saying it is not enough because we don't have a requirement that everyone be fluent in isiXhosa, for example. I'm not Xhosa. But I think it would be great for all of us to have a requirement that staff and students learn isiXhosa because we are in this province and the majority of people, at least the marginalized people. Afrikaans, of course, it's also very present here, but almost all of us have had to learn Afrikaans. So that's not because of the apartheid South Africa. So we, the three languages that are dominant here, English, Afrikaans, and isiXhosa, I think we could do more to ensure that Afrikaans and isiXhosa get more prominence than they do currently. But frankly speaking, we do a lot that people don't know because we don't look like we could promote African languages in that way, but we do.
Thank you. And I'll pretend that there was no hidden agenda to promote Welsh and Swahili at the University of Bristol behind that question.
Oh yeah, well, I think University of Bristol should consider Swahili. I mean, it's the most spoken African language. So I actually think, and the African Union recently announced it as the official language of the African Union. And that's another reason why we want to do it, and we are planning to collaborate with the University of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. So I mean, it's one way of building collaboration, but also of saying this. This is not talk only when we say we build in collaboration. But of course, I don't know how the linguistic mix of Bristol is, but I say whatever linguistic mix. I mean I know that some universities in the US teach Yoruba, which is from Nigeria, but I think Swahili is the way to go.
Yeah, thank you. We have more questions. We have more questions from South Africa.
Oh, okay.
So we have a question from Justin Tabbert, who's asking, in South Africa, how much, the questions are flipping around, how much media, entertainment or literature is presented in English as opposed to other official languages? And how much of an impact do you think more media in other languages would have in contributing to social cohesion?
I think it wouldn't contribute if media in other languages wouldn't have a very powerful contribution to social cohesion if people do not understand the languages. I mean, I think if you have some of the recommendations that I said, that we have everyone learning an African language, then you will see the numbers for African languages, whether SOPs or whatever, going up, right? So and that wouldn't just be African people. Of course, we are a majority, so that will always be cooked up. But you will see those becoming popular, and I think at the moment they're not, because it's quite tricky because they're not, people don't know the language. It works only with African people. Like we have a show in Chivenda, which is not very big and is spoken mainly in the north, and it's not such an easy language. And when Muvango, it's called Muvango, when Muvango came on television and it had subtitles, more Black people started learning Chivenda because it was so good. I don't know if it's still on TV, but it was so good that people got into Muvango because of the storyline, and then the language. But these are African people who are excited by the African story. They're not getting into it because of the language, but they're seeing this story that's unfolding that they want to be part of. But I think this media and so on can be mixed with the requirement of learning a language. But by the way, Angeline, I didn't say anything. I'm not sure if anyone is asking that. I didn't say anything about learning in a language. Okay, so in my view, you can have learning a language, learning about the language, and learning in a language. And in my recommendations, I'm not talking at all about learning in a language. And that's actually, when there's debates, whatever, that's what people are going for. Frankly speaking, on a bad day, I think that's a strategy to delay us. Because learning in a language, firstly, asks for us to agree on the standard language that we will use, because if we're learning in a language, now that debate doesn't end, it goes on and on and on, right? So I'm saying, let's start little. Everyone, get your fluency right. It's a requirement. At least after that, now more of us can speak. We can then talk about learning in a language. Why do we even talk about that when more and more of African Black young people don't even learn their own African languages at school because they choose English, because they can only choose two. They choose English, and then the school doesn't offer anything. They go for Afrikaans because they want a social mobility. So I think we start little.
Yeah. Rutherford Odoye has raised a question which I know is often a subject of debate. He's talking about the South African context. I know it's debated in other African contexts, but it relates to what you're saying, language always being political, but this concern that when you have 9 official languages, that the social cohesion can actually be threatened by one of those African languages becoming more dominant. And I know this kind of debate goes on even more so, I think, in other African countries where there's a fear that promoting an African language will kind of somehow lead to tribalism, and therefore English is seen as being neutral. I think you've challenged the idea that English is neutral, but I wonder how you would respond to that.
Yeah, South Africa is not a small country, it's a big country. Even now, there are languages that are dominant in particular areas of the country. If you go to KwaZulu-Natal, it makes sense for the University of KwaZulu-Natal to have isiZulu as one of their official languages. In the Western Cape, it makes sense to do that. So it doesn't mean that there will only be one language all across. But what it means is that we have 26 universities. In all of those 26 universities, each of the 11 languages or the 10 languages will be official in at least one of those universities. Yeah. I mean, the Gauteng, where Johannesburg, Pretoria are, is much more cosmopolitan, but there are more universities. And so there can be an agreement where do we place isiZulu, where do we place isiXhosa or whatever it is, or Sepedi and so on. So some languages might have a presence in more than one university, like we have Sesotho and isiXhosa. So I don't think it will do that. I mean, I know that there's been arguments before that we should group the African languages into Nguni and whatever. And you know, that argument was made by Neville Alexander, who was here at UCT. I mean, the minute I heard it, I thought this will not fly. Again, firstly, because who's saying it? And, you know, I mean, you can't tell us that your language is going to be, you can't even speak these languages, you know. So the debate ended up, at least among Africans, being, wow, he's undermining our languages. So he's telling us that Sesotho and Sepedi and Setswana are just the same. So just congregate under Setswana, you know, when in fact, language is not separate from culture. And the cultural practices of the Bapedis and the Batswanas are very different. And so what are you doing if you combining them under one? You know, but that argument is made, you know, to say, if we do that, it might actually be better to manage these 11 languages. I don't think it's a difficult thing to manage 11 languages in a country such as ours. In fact, even without managing them, there's dominance of particular languages in particular provinces. And it's only one province that's very multilingual. And the people in that province, I come from there, you automatically learn the variety of languages. You don't even have to go to school, because that's just what life is in Gauteng, you know? And we recognize it as a value, as a valuable thing, that you end up speaking 9, 10 languages.
Yeah, thank you. And a number of questions, of course, have highlighted how languages are political, that fear of a dominance of a language in other contexts as well. So Viv has got a question coming from Ireland, and Alia Mokhtar has a question coming from Malaysia, and I won't ask you to respond to those, because obviously those are very different contexts, but it just says, it shows how these debates have to be held within different contexts.
But there are similarities all across. I mean, I've collaborated with researchers from Malaysia who teach in Chinese schools, and some who teach in Malay schools. And I mean, the politics are much trickier, you know, as to why, when they changed the language policy to English as the language of learning and teaching, the Chinese schools were exempt. They had a special arrangement because they stood up and said, please, can you allow us? Because they wanted to have their language still very strong in their schools. You know, and then the English medium didn't work, then they go back to Malay. I mean, it's very similar. It's about power and access, whatever. Very similar.
Yeah. Professor Phakeng, Phakeng is International Women's Day, as Lauren noted at the beginning, and, you know, at the risk of kind of drawing in another political issue, I wonder if you'd comment on whether you see any intersectionality between language and gender, and how that can play out in about some of the different contexts that you know about.
Wow, language and gender.
Perhaps in mathematics classrooms. I don't know if you observed mathematics classrooms where using English, for example, is working to silence girls more than boys, or in other contexts, boys more than girls.
You know, I mean, in mathematics classrooms, usually girls are silenced, but it's not always because of the language. It's because of other things. Language becomes an added factor, and class becomes an added factor. So yeah, I don't know if I would see language in that way, unless we're talking about the language that we can use that gets not in terms of language choice, but the way of talking that can get into the intersectionality of our being. Then that's you know, that's where I guess that's where the debate could be.
Yeah.
And people feeling rendered invisible by the language that we use to refer to them, address them, and stuff like that.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I think that's we've worked through, in some sense, have addressed or touched on all the questions that were posted, and we can end the discussion there.
Thank you very much, Angeline.
Thank you, Mamokgethi.
Brilliant, thank you. So as Angeline noted, we've made our way through questions. It's been a fantastic, engaged discussion. We are coming up to time, so we're just going to start to wrap up now. So I personally wanted to take this opportunity to once again thank Professor Phakeng for such thought-provoking talk, but also such engaged and thorough responses to the questions and exploring the topics raised. It was really interesting, and I really enjoyed the Q&A as well as the presentation. Actually, my own postgraduate research was on rock art, including paintings by the sun. So I particularly enjoyed hearing that referenced because it doesn't always come up that much. So it's a real kind of passion of mine. And thank you also to Angeline, to Dr. Barrett for chairing that really interesting Q&A and for doing such a good job of kind of bringing questions together and exploring the themes and picking out the key points of those. And of course, we have to say a huge special thank you to Unati for the valuable sign language interpretation throughout this webinar. Must be absolutely exhausted. You've been doing a great job. So we're really grateful, and it helps to ensure that this webinar is accessible to a much wider range. So that's fantastic. Thank you. Thank you also to all of our participants for attending and for the great questions and for engaging with the topic. I've also seen, and hopefully Mamokgethi has seen as well, quite a few notes of thanks and congratulations and so forth in the Q&A. So I just want to reiterate those positive messages of appreciation for the talk. We're glad to see so much engagement, and hope that means that everyone found it interesting and inspiring. Obviously, we've got the people in the webinar itself, but we've also got 100 or so other people on the live stream, and people are going to be watching it back. So we hope you all enjoy it, and do get in touch if you've got anything that you want to follow up with. As I mentioned in my opening, Mamokgethi's year-long professorship, Bristol Illustrious Visiting Professorship, started in October. So we're kind of coming up towards halfway through. We've still got quite a bit of time. We're really excited to see how that develops further. We've had some great conversations so far with academics from across the university, but also our senior management team and other members of our university and our wider community. So we're really excited to work together further and see how we can make both of our universities, but also our wider communities stronger and learn from one another with that. So there's hopefully going to be loads of positive impacts for our staff, our students, and then that wider community, and also for those hoping to become part of our communities in the future. And we hope these kind of conversations inspire people to feel that they belong in this kind of environments and that they can come and join us. So we'll be putting up a slide in just a moment with a link to our website where you can find out more about Professor Phakeng and her Bristol Illustrious Visiting Professorship, as well as our email address. So if you're interested in getting in touch, finding out more, you've got any questions you want to put forward that we didn't get to, for example, then please do get in touch. We'd love to hear from you. And again, we hope you enjoyed it. Thank you to everyone, and all the best for International Women's Day 2022. We hope that you will feel appreciated and valued and respected like we deserve. So